Hello again, and welcome back to another episode of Minds on Guard, where we're talking about media and all of its manifestations in our daily lives, the way we use it, the way we interact with it, the way it manipulates us, and the ways that people who design it and program it use it to control our thoughts and behaviors. Let's dive right in. We got some exciting stuff to go over this week. Some historical things and some personalities that I want to introduce to kind of set the stage for some future videos and some deeper discussions. Last week we started discussing some historical material as well as a little bit of psychology, and we mentioned a book by a woman named Charlotte Thompson Iserbyt. The title of that book is The Deliberate Dumbing Down of America. And in that book, Mrs. Iserbyt outlines a concerted and directed effort to really infiltrate the United States education system and implement a sort of cultural programming initiative that was geared towards changing Americans' behavior and really getting us thinking in certain ways that would achieve the goals of a global network of central planners. I introduced a man by the name of Wilhelm Wundt, and he is the first person that we're going to dig into regarding the historical context of where we are today as it pertains to 21st century media and how it plays on our thoughts, behaviors, and feelings. Okay, so Wilhelm Wundt was a German scientist who many regard as the world's first psychologist. Before Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung, Wundt was developing during the middle to late 1800s what would become to be known as experimental psychology. His work would become instrumental in the development of the American education system and our culture at large. Wundt was trained as a physiologist, and he had a deep understanding of both human and animal anatomy. Throughout his career, he became especially focused on the understanding of human perceptive experience and just what all was happening within the minds of humans. In Mrs. Iserbyt's book, she notes that Wundt became focused on understanding the workings of the human soul. This focus led him to conduct experiments on human cognition and perception with a specific emphasis on the relationships shared between motivation of will and the emotional responses that underpin our cognitive processes. Now, through these experiments, Wundt concluded that the human mind could be understood as the sum total of a person's life experiences, and he viewed these essentially as components of a simple machine that could, if understood properly, be deconstructed, then observed and studied. The sum of these experiences that people have and the resulting behavior that was observed was to be understood simply through the lens of what's known as a stimulus response. By equating the perceptive capacity of humans with that of components of a simple machine that's responding to outside stimuli, Wundt stripped away the idea of an inherent human soul that it exists within every person and that governed his will and self-determination, and that thus placing humans on the level of animals, only capable of basic reactive responses to the information that is absorbed by our minds. Now, this is a very naturalistic approach, and it's one that is quite heavily adopted by neo-Darwinians, people that are adamant about, survival of the fittest, evolution versus creation. It's a very naturalist, materialist worldview. One of the best books for understanding exactly how Wundt's ideas made their way into education is titled The Leipzig Connection by a man named Paulo Lionni. Now, Leonni delves into the theoretical concepts and the influence of Wundt on modern education by examining his establishment and work at what was known as the Leipzig Laboratory. This was the institution where he conducted most of his experimental psychology and developed his concepts regarding the stimulus response mechanisms that he thinks or thought were present within the human mind. Wundt believed that human behavior was able to be directed and controlled by enacting varied and very specific experiences that would produce a corresponding behavior. Through experimentation with various stimulus combinations in the Leipzig lab, he determined that the outcomes would become predictable over a given period of time. This is where the major jump from the lab to the classroom would occur, and the shift from the theoretical concepts that Wundt was developing to the practical application would actually take hold. By implementing Wundt's ideas about directing human behavior, the processes of education shifted from one where the innate talents and abilities of any single person were drawn out by imparting the knowledge of languages, scientific reasoning, history, mathematics, etc., and they became replaced with the notion that exposing students to, quote, meaningful experiences would be most effective in achieving the desired outcomes of the institutions of education. Recall we talked about the Prussian model where there was a state-run compulsory education system, and the objectives of the state were to essentially maximize their position in the world. They knew that they would do this through the education system, and the children of the future would carry out their goals. Rather than that classical education model, where a student develops as an individual, able to learn through the application of core principles of thought gained by deep study and really studying reality and all that's contained within it. The concepts of Wundt assumed that the mind was only able to learn through inducing sensations that mimicked past experiences that any person might have. This would then trigger the responses that the scientists were looking for. Through this experimental stimulation, an individual would learn to respond to any given stimulus with the, quote, correct response. This model of education completely does away with the notion that a child possesses any control over their own actions and is not capable of deciding whether they will or will not act in any certain way. Working from the theory that the human mind is simply a response mechanism, behaviors are then seen as predetermined, and all any man can ever be is his reaction to a given stimulus. The soul is completely removed. A man's cognitive capacities, his decision-making skills, his heart motives, all of it is removed and stripped away, and we're reduced to the level of animals. Leonni writes, Wundt's thesis laid the philosophical basis for the principles of conditioning later developed by Ivan Pavlov, who actually studied in Leipzig in 1884, 5 years after Wundt had inaugurated his laboratory there, and an American behavioral psychologist such as Watson and B.F. Skinner. For lobotomies and electroconvulsive therapy, for schools oriented more towards the socialization of the child rather than the development of intellect, and for the emergence of a society more and more blatantly devoted to the gratification of sensory desires at the expense of responsibility and achievement. Now, it would take a lot of time for these ideas to make their way into the American education system. During that time, the work being done at the Leipzig laboratory would attract a number of influential minds from all over Europe and America to come and study there. This new form of experimental psychology was seen as bold and daring, and in an era that was primed for the technological advancements and the achievements of the Industrial Revolution, the Leipzig lab provided yet another avenue for innovation. The laboratory developed into a type of school where students would come and be exposed to the experimental psychology. This field was beginning to take off as a revolutionary new idea, and soon it would become an international phenomenon. Many young, eager American students would come to Leipzig and return home to implement all that they learned into the universities and began to found and establish departments at very prestigious institutions. The first American student of Wundt to come back to the States and found one such institution was a man named G. Stanley Hall. Hall returned to America in 1883 and joined the faculty at Johns Hopkins University. I know we've all been hearing that name in the news quite a bit over the last 2 years. After joining that faculty, he established their psychology laboratory. Then in 1887, while at the university, he established the American Journal of Psychology, where all major publications would be done on the same subject and in this field. Later, in 1892, Hall was instrumental in establishing the American Psychological Association, which would be the accreditation board that now governs all psychologists in the United States. They set protocols, they write literature, and they, deem what is correct. This is where experts come from in this field. His influence in the field of experimental psychology in America was just undeniable, and by extension, the work that was foundational from within the Leipzig school. Hall was particularly invested in the study of child development and psychology. And in 1904, he would publish what could be called his masterwork. This was titled Adolescence, Its Psychology and Its Relations to Physiology, Anthropology, Sociology, Sex, Crime, Religion, and Education. It was this work that would serve to connect the study of experimental psychology to the education of America's children. If Wilhelm Wundt is to receive credit for the notion that man has no self-determining will or soul, then it was Hall who brought these ideas to America and thus paved the way for them to infiltrate our culture. Alright, so we've made it to the end of this video. I know there was a lot of really technical information and a lot of expository reading going on there, but this subject is really important, and the history is extremely vital to being able to understand exactly how we got to where we are today. Thinking about the ideas that man is essentially just a machine that can be programmed to elicit a response that is acceptable or correct to the people who desire a certain outcome is a really troubling thing. And it's really not that crazy and difficult to see that that's exactly what's going on when we engage with news media, social media, all of the ways that modern media is exposed and is forced upon us throughout the day. These concepts and ideas that were developed in Germany in the 1800s, they exist and are extremely prevalent in every aspect of our lives in the 21st century. I hope that you found this information interesting, informative. Please comment, or if you have any questions, ask them in the comments below. I'll do my best to respond and see if I can clarify some stuff. Again, I recommend the book, The Leipzig Connection by Paulo Lionni. It's very short, and it has a lot more information that we'll delve into a little bit later, but it's some really crucial stuff regarding the funding and just who was behind all of what was going on with the shift of the American education system. That's all for now. I'm going to wrap up this video for the evening. I hope you all enjoyed this information. Until the next video, I hope you all stay very safe. I hope you all look after each other, and please stay diligent and vigilant with your minds on guard.